81 people on this call, George.
I think we're probably good to go now, Stephen.
You're on mute, Stephen.
Thank you. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Stephen Eames. I'm the lead for the Humber Coast and Vale ICS and have the privilege of chairing this first webinar in the series around making sense of integrated care systems today. Could I just extend a warm welcome to Duncan, Andrew and Fiona from Frimley, who are going to be presenting later on in our agenda. And it's great to see we've got 93 and counting in attendance today, so that's really excellent and hope you get a lot out of this event. Could I just pick up a few housekeeping points first? We are recording this session. Please let us know in the chat box if anybody is concerned about that. As ever, I guess we're all familiar with this now, but please put yourself on mute when others are speaking, so we can avoid background noise and so on. We've got time set aside at the end for about 25 minutes, which I think is really valuable time for question and answers. So please use the chat function for that. If you lose your connection, you can rejoin using the same link that you joined with. And if you've got any problems at all, don't refer them to me, refer them to Fiona Wildman, who is in charge of all the tech. And could I just plug the evaluation form? We're very keen as we start this series of webinars to get feedback. So be grateful if you could spend a moment or two when we get there to complete that for us. So could we go on? So our agenda, I'm just in a moment going to give a quick overview of the policy and context around integrated care systems. And then we're going to go straight on from the lessons learned from Frimley with our three colleagues joining us from that system, and then to the Q&A, and then just a few points of summary and feedback at the end, and we will close as scheduled at 2 o'clock. Next slide, please. So I've said this is the first in a series of webinars, and we are intending to run these across the next few months. And this is a collaboration, and so we're delivering these webinars together between the LGA, NHS Providers, the NHS Confederation, and bringing in colleagues like myself and Fiona, Andrew, and Duncan as we go through the programme across the year. Just a bit of a plug again, the next two for your diary, 21st of September, we're looking there particularly at NED and counsellor engagement, and then again a week later on the 28th, co-producing with and engaging with communities. So look out for those. We'll be advertising them obviously in advance. So if I can go on to sort of setting the scene, next slide please. I think most people will be up to speed with where we are, but just to sort of summarize it, I think probably before I do that, just to say that having spent what feels like a very long time working in the NHS and seen many bills through Parliament, I can't remember one as light touch as this one. and therefore as permissive as this one. And I think that's really important given the nature of integrated care systems and the nature of working in partnership. But what the legislation does do is put an ICS, NHS body, unitary board, and an ICS health and care partnership in the statute, very firmly emphasises the principal primary role of place-based partnerships with delegated responsibilities and freedoms in place. Looks to embed whole population health approaches, the huge focus that we've all got, increasingly so post-pandemic, on health inequalities. I would also say enshrines integration as a way of working, collaboration as a way of working. Now, many of us have been doing that for many, many years, but certainly in the NHS, in a quasi-market system for the last 2 or 3 decades. So we shouldn't underestimate the scope and complexity of that change and the cultural shifts required to move firmly into that model of working. Establishing provider collaboratives and a more collaborative commissioning set of arrangements across systems with significant, I think, additional responsibilities and roles for providers in that context. It's a tight timetable. Royal Assent planned this winter. So I think in many ways, this comes into play formally, legally from April next year, but I think that should be regarded as at the end of the beginning. I think what we're all probably working on across the ICS community is putting the basics in place that will be required to operate. There's much more to do developmentally, at least over the next 18 months. And of course, that transition is already underway. And there's a wide range of guidance, which I'm reliably, and I sort of put that in inverted commas, but reliably informed, we will start to see from the back end of this week across a whole range of advice around place, collaboratives, governance, and so on and so forth. Let's go on to the next slide if we could. Now, if you look at all of the commentary from the health service and across local government, and there's been significant involvement of the LGA and the local government voice throughout the development of the white paper and the bill, and very much so at local level across ICSs across this country. There is broad agreement about the direction of travel here, and I think most people think that ICSs will be well equipped to meet the challenges that we're all facing over the next decade. And realistically, some of those challenges in some parts of the country are more significant than they were before the pandemic because of the pandemic. So I don't think integration, a focus on health inequality as collaboration is in any sense a soft option. Most of us who've lived through that in practical terms have derived the benefit from that way of working and really want to sustain that as we move forward. And that involves removing barriers to integration between NHS organisations and moving away from silo working wherever we can, and particularly between NHS and social care. But I would also add to that the broader communities that we serve and the VCSE and third sector that are, again, have been really important to the way we provide services in whatever sector in health and care, but I think become more important as we move into the next 18 months and beyond. I think this third point's really important. I know we've seen tensions, and I think we still will see tensions between a directed central approach and a locally orientated engaging approach. But I think ICSs are firmly committed to local development, and particularly development at place. And, you know, making the connection between integrating services, which fundamentally is what we're trying to do, and demonstrating a difference to the people that use them. That is very easy to say, but I think there's a significant set of challenges involved in doing that really well. And I guess I've made this point implicitly in what I've said, but I mean, I've always found whenever I've worked and wherever I've worked in complex systems, that the key thing more than anything else is good relationships at every level. And I think the best foundation trust, best Freudian slip from previous career path, the best ICSs are built on those foundations of good relationships and getting things done despite the challenges. So could we move on? This slide just summarizes some of the areas of concern, again, that you would probably have picked up as you scan the horizon nationally about this. A lot of concern about the Secretary of State's power to intervene in the NHS. Well, I think it's an unknown, actually, because on the one hand, that could be an issue, as this particular bullet point sets out. But certainly I've experienced, as I'm sure others have, big change programs that probably were the right thing to do, but could never really be delivered because of local context, local politics, and so on, and might have benefited for an intervention. So I'm I'm sitting on the fence on this one at the moment, but there's been a lot of concern about how that power might be exercised, particularly about undermining local leadership, etc. A lot of lively discussion in one of these forums very recently. We're having quite a lot of discussion about the role of health and wellbeing boards and how that relates to ICSs, and I think you could extend that to you know, how will the ICS Unitary Board and the partnership at the heart of the ICS work. So these are all live issues. I think quite a lot of work to be done still around accountability and decision making within this complex framework. You know, how do you do it? Who holds whom to account? Where does local democracy fit in with all of that? Those sorts of questions. I think the bill actually, and is probably in terms of people like me, a bit watered down in the context of workforce planning. I'm not really making a comment on local government here, but the NHS hasn't been very good at that for a whole variety of reasons. But I think if you ask anybody about what their main risk is in relation to delivering now against our massively challenging agenda and the success of ICSs, most people would say the workforce. So I think it's a massive issue for us as a collective nationally in the ICSs and beyond, and indeed the leadership in both local government and the NHS. There has been quite a lot of talk in the last week or two about adult social care reforms. I might be as bold as to say that really, unless we get a settlement and reform in social care, the ambitions in the NHS long-term plan and the broad ambitions of ICSs would be significantly compromised. So I think it's a really critical issue in terms of finding a way forward on this thorny challenge during the course of this transitional year that we're in. And the last point is, of course, I think one of the important roles for ICSs is to try and keep the weight off the front line. With all this change going on, I think there's a duty to design the future and be focused on the medium and longer term, but at the same time, make sure there's full support for the really difficult frontline challenges that we're currently experiencing. And I think we will see as we even more of as we move into the winter. Could we move on? So just a few opportunities to outline here. It's not an exclusive list. You'll have your own thoughts about this. But there are significant, some people talk about the biggest opportunity for health and care in a generation through these models of collaboration and through a much stronger focus on outcomes rather than inputs and processes. And that is an opportunity to be grasped without any doubt at all. And that second bullet point really emphasizes that. Place I mentioned before, but just to reinforce the phrase that we tend to use in my ICS, in my region, is it's an 80-20 principle, broadly speaking. So 80% of the action really is at place. And actually, in addressing some of the things I've touched on around the socio-economic recovery, that has to be done. I mean, there are big picture things around recruitment, around climate, around other things that ICSs will be very valuable in taking forward. But really addressing left behind people, increased poverty, unemployment, some of the big, the longer waiting times that we currently have. I think what the experience of the last 18 months has taught us that local is best. And so a real commitment, I think, throughout the ICS movement to that, and this notion, which I think is a really important principle about equal partnership between health, local government, and the VCSE. Again, it's something that's really easy to say, but hard sometimes to practice. Different systems, different cultures, different geographic and other challenges. But that is the spirit, I think, in which the best ICSs will operate. I'm not sure about that bullet point, evolution, not revolution. I think it's a bit of both. But I think the essence of it is to many ICSs across the country have been in place previously as SDPs for 4 or 5 years. So there is a lot about building on existing practice, building on existing relationships and some of the good things that are going on. But I think if ICSs are to be different, then I think they do need to be disruptive and, inverted commas, revolutionary if we're going to meet some of those aims that we all have. The bullet point behind that really emphasizes some of that shift towards prevention, personal care, population health, etc. And health inequalities and engagement with the wider determinants. So my sort of simple point on that is, if we were writing a book about these reforms and it had 10 chapters, I guess the health service is only one of them. If we think about the broader challenge that we've got on regional geographies, which obviously differ around the country, but also in local places, in relation to health inequality, wider determinants, and the other big indicators around, the workforce and inward investment and all those sorts of things. I've made the point already, I won't labour it, but we're all very keen to retain as much local flexibility and permissiveness as possible. And certainly when I listen to colleagues in some of the events that we've done through this particular collaboration between local government and the NHS, that is the thing that people value most and want to preserve most. And within that, clearly, a need to improve accountability and transparency. So I think I'm on to my last slide, or maybe it's the penultimate one. But just a few questions. I won't go through them all because I guess these might point towards the discussion at the end. But these are some of the questions that are in people's minds. There will be others about, will this really make a difference? how does accountability work? Can we really deliver on those big picture ambitions that are set out in the aspirations of the long-term plan and other national strategies, as well as our local ambitions? Last slide, then, I think, from me. I think that this is just to say, working together as a collective, the LGA, Clinical Commissioners, NHS Providers, the Confed, we're trying to support all of this collectively at national level, and I think there's evidence that this is happening around influencing legislation and pressing for improvements where we need them, etc. Strongly advocating what I've just been talking about around place and embedding that in the way that we work. And providing support and advice through things like this webinar and in other activities to support systems across the country, support some of the change agendas and very complex change agendas that people are pursuing, and looking to cross-pollinate best practice and learning wherever we can. So that's just a quick run across the policy context. There's much more to it than what I've outlined in the last 15 minutes or so. I'm sure we'll come back to it. And I'm going to hand over, I think, to Fiona first, if I may. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephen. It's Andrew that's going to kick off, our independent chair. So over to Andrew.
Yes, thank you very much, Stephen. That was a really helpful introduction. And firstly, I'm very pleased that we've been given the opportunity to come along today to share the Frimley story and to reflect on our learnings throughout our journey to date. I'll seek to set the scene, highlight some of the elements we believe have contributed to our development and some of our achievements and indeed our learning. I'll then hand over to Fiona, who is our accountable officer for the Frimley ICS, and also, of course, the chief executive of our system, and she'll highlight further many of those elements. I'm really pleased, though, that we're also joined, as you've seen, by Duncan Sharkey, the chief executive of the Royal Borough of Windsor and Maidenhead, with that very grand backdrop you'll have all seen behind him on the screen. And that reflects, I think, not only the fact, obviously, he's got such a lot to contribute today, but the fact that local authorities are very central and a key partner within our system. We recognise, obviously, the important role of the counties and the unitaries in relation to social care, but also the impact that their services have on the wider determinants of health and well-being more generally. And they do bring that deep understanding around place and communities. And of course, they have a democratic legitimacy through their democratically elected members. Time is tight, so I won't dwell on the structure of Frimley, which is available online, but we are one of the smaller ICSs with a population of 800,000. We've got 3 unitary authorities, 2 parts of 2 county councils, and of course a range of providers, community, mental health and acute and so forth, and PCNs. Our system was really effectively born back in 2016 on the back of the old STP planning process. And we were one of the first wave ICSs in 2017, so effectively went live in April 2018. Many of you have been aware of the recent boundary review, and at the conclusion of that, we were really pleased that the Secretary of State confirmed the continuation of Frimley within its existing boundaries, so we can now move forward with certainty. But I think it's really important to say, and a chance to say this publicly, that we absolutely understand the legitimate concerns expressed by our 2 county councils, Hampshire and Surrey, and we're really committed to working with them to mitigate the negative effects of lack of coterminosity and to find ways to mitigate those and to make it work for all concerned. So I just wanted to make that very clear, because that's really, really important to us, because both counties have been such important partners from the very beginning. As a system, though, and this touches on a few of the themes that Stephen picked up on, we're strongly united around a shared vision to improve the health of our communities and to address health inequalities, which is evident in pockets across our system and which have come into even sharper focus, of course, as a result of the COVID pandemic. But we have a long and a proud history of collaboration. Indeed, I would almost describe it as a culture of collaboration within and across the system, which we often describe as a coalition of the willing. We've worked really hard to build strong and trusting relationships, which are sometimes described by our partners as very human and very personal. And there's no doubt that the strength of those relationships really helped the COVID response, including, of course, the rapid introduction of mutual aid. And we've also sought to create a safe space, particularly within the partnership board, but not exclusively, elsewhere, of course, across our system, where our partners genuinely feel empowered and able to discuss, tackle, and reach consensus around very difficult issues. That's involved obviously shared priorities, it's involved risk sharing and of course funding allocations. And so far those relationships have worked extremely well. And of course pre-COVID we had very regular board development sessions, but they have been put on hold but will be resumed. And I think it's fair to say that the strength of our relationships and the collaborative spirit has allowed us to move forward hitherto with a very light touch approach to governance. Some have seen it as particularly light touch, but it's worked really well with us, which we believe governance should be an enabler and not an over bureaucratic and potentially unintentional barrier to innovation and progress. We've also invested very heavily on staff development, and I'm sure Fiona will pick this up. Clearly, as we move on to a more statutory footing, we will be and are starting to review and evolve our governance. But we're really keen to make sure that it's fit for purpose and very clearly suitable to the position that we have within the Frimley system. Amongst that, of course, will be the role of elected members and, of course, non-executives and lay members, which is really important. Picking again up on Stephen's point, we really welcome the permissiveness and flexibility inherent within the bill. But if we have a worry, and that is that with all the forthcoming guidance, that doesn't end up diluting that permissiveness and becoming over-prescriptive, because we must go back to the mantra, one size doesn't fit all. What works in Frimley surely won't work in Manchester and vice versa. But before I hand over to Fiona, I'd just like to highlight some of the further learning points that I think are worth bearing in mind. One that we're very clear on is the importance of making full and best use of data and rich insights across health and care. Secondly, continuing to focus on the impact of COVID-19 on communities and, of course, on inequalities. The importance of strong community engagement and relationships and the extent to which that can help our understanding of wider determinants of health. The need also to understand the importance, the dynamic, the relationship between elected members and senior council officers, and to respect the democratic accountability of elected members. Finally, and also not to take for granted, but to preserve that strength of partnership and collaboration as we move into a new statutory structure. And I come back to where I started, really, the importance of the coalition of the willing. So at that point, if I may, I'll hand over now to Fiona.
Thank you, Andrew. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for having the delegation from Frimley to share our learning. We are in a really challenging space, as I'm sure many colleagues are on this call. And what we thought we'd share is, and really building on a lot of what Andrew said, is what we think we've learnt most that sustains real collaboration and integration for the benefit of our residents and communities. And if I could go to the next slide, please. So this is where we start. Andrew talked about the investment that we've given in really having a sense of common purpose and drive. And this slide tries to encapsulate how we think in Frimley. And this is the tip of the iceberg of a huge amount of strategic development we did back in 2018, where we spent 6 months drawing together data insights from our digital platform, which I will talk a wee bit more about in a minute, but also combining that with multiple indicators from our public health colleagues, who I can see some are on this call today, national data sets that really drew our eye to a local and quite a detailed picture of the challenge across our system. You'll see across the bottom of the slide a naming of some places in Frimley, we use the word place, I think, and I think this is a challenge nationally as well as locally in quite a loose way, because place to me, living in the Royal Borough of Windsor and Maidenhead, can mean Windsor Castle, it can mean Wexham Park Hospital, it can mean Frimley Park Hospital, it can be my daughter's old primary school down the road. And so we have, as a delivery vehicle, named 5 localities, but they don't map onto a naturally defined place from a resident's point of view. And we are doing some work as a system to really learn how to talk in a way about place that engages as many people as possible, because it isn't, what we're learning is that place is absolutely, we should be working as locally and as connected to residents as possible. And most of the expertise are regarding social and wider determinant of health sits within our local authority partners alongside and with the voluntary sector, as Stephen alluded to right at the beginning. However, we also need to be really conscious and talking about system-wide as well as place. So we increasingly say we think about system working as a non-binary process, that we have to have fluidity and a series of conversations that help us determine our priorities. And back to the strategy, what it showed us was the depth of, and the data analytics showed us the massive inequality between places like Slough versus its immediate next door neighbour, one of the richest boroughs in the country, the Royal Borough of Windsor and Maidenhead, and also how that mapped to really appalling differences in child mortality between those two boroughs, or between Bracknell and between Surrey Heath, for example. And so it really, the data really jolted the leadership community into a discussion of population need and how on earth we in our society could have such gaps, evidence through poor health outcomes. And it maps deprivation, we all know it, but seeing it in a stark way. And then to build this strategy, which is shaped in our quite bizarre rainbow, we also combined that with insights through our community panel, which is made up of about 1,500 people, but also surveys out supported by a Health Watch. And interestingly, we asked questions about what would keep you well and healthy. And what came back was really primarily health, access to activity and health, very little about the quality of service delivery. Now, we do benefit, we've got quite high quality health provider organisations across Frimley, but the demand from our communities for our collected efforts was really much less about intervention and more about support in terms of activity, eating well, and community and social connections. And that led us to shape the strategy, the data, the experience and engagement with our communities, and then the feedback from our staff across the system, health, social care and voluntary sector staff, that led us to shape our priorities into our 6 ambitions. So we talk about starting well and focusing on wellbeing, building community deals in partnership with our citizens, and then really focusing on people and managing resources well. And one of the things Frimley is known well for in the Southeast is always managing within our health control total. And we consciously talk about that as a marker of success and giving us freedom and liberty to act in behalf and in concert with our colleagues across our system. So our core purpose, just as enshrined in the national guidance, as a system. We lived and breathed it in developing our strategy in 2018 is about tackling health inequalities, and we really try as a system to live and breathe that. And I'd like to go to the next slide, and coming back to Andrew's point about leadership and culture. So we benefit from having a leadership academy which grew out of some work that predates the Frimley system and ICS and STP movement. It actually goes back to the original vanguard work done in the NHS, and we have consciously invested. You saw one of the sixth ambition, which I didn't mention, is leadership and culture. We consciously said we have to drive and work on how we work together for the benefits of our citizens and residents as a leadership community across public service, the voluntary sector, and increasingly with our private sector companies and partners in our system, that we will never ever be able to fundamentally shift the dial on health inequalities if we don't really consciously, as an integrated care system, work on supporting how we connect and work well together. And as Andrew said, it is about equality of voice across the system, and moving away in that, recognising the kind of pyramid and hierarchy and institutional focus of all our constituent members, but really also trying to, if you like, take a collaboration, building a constellation of stars that are interconnected and can shine equally when we come together for our communities. And so we've consciously invested in leadership development programs that are multi-agency, multi-hierarchical, and have built a depth of connectivity across our system that has risen over around about 5 years. And we've got the 2020 programme, we've got our wavelength digital competence programme, and we also consciously, Andrew mentioned how we collaborate in our board and our leadership arrangements. And one thing we do in the board, and a top tip for people to think about, is we don't start a meeting without doing a roundtable check-in. So people, and many of our social care colleagues will probably recognise the value of this, because that's where I learnt it from, which is that you just invite people to join in a conversation, expressing where they're at and what's on their mind as a human being, or as with priorities and pressures. And then we can then speed through the business together, because we've got a really strong sense of where everyone is, and we get a real rich data share, if you like. And that's one example of how we try to practically work together. One of the areas we really have to work on, and are beginning to learn more and more, particularly through COVID, is around inclusion and diversity. We have, in microcosm, one of the most diverse populations in the country, with Slough at more than 50% of our population from Black, Asian, minority ethnic background, with Aldershot with a very large Nepalese community, and with Bracknell Forest, where we have a sizable Gypsy, Roma and Traveller community. And you'll see that the leadership, the three of us, you wouldn't know that from looking at me, Andrew or Duncan. And so we have a real leadership challenge to reflect and improve the diversity of our leadership, particularly from a Black, Asian, minority ethnic point of view. And we've also got real health inequalities to address and learn. And we learned a huge amount through COVID from working with our Slough community. We've managed to do vaccination rates of an order that we've never achieved there before, but we've had to learn really fast to work in a fundamentally different way. And you might want to talk with us about that, because we know we've got a huge amount further to go. Can I go to my last slide, and then I'll hand to Duncan? I just wanted to talk about PAN system working. I saw Keith, the leader of Hampshire County Council, join us, and it has to be reflected that even though we have arguments and disagreements, and coterminosity might have been one of them, we have hugely strong partnership arrangements. My Hampshire colleagues play a very strong leadership role in the Frimley Integrated Care leadership arrangements, and help us really think, for example, about local authority and social care challenges. And this is an example of where Frimley pitched to be in a strong leadership role around digital, to build our digital capability. So we offer and lead the Thames Valley and Surrey Shared Care Record Programme, which has underpinned building our data analytic capability and is now supporting that spreading in Surrey, Berkshire, across the whole of Berkshire, Bucks and soon Oxfordshire. And so one of the learnings for us has been you have to play bigger than system as well as in your system. Don't put boundaries and concrete arrangements around yourselves. And on that note, I think I'll hand over to Duncan to wrap us up with a local authority perspective. Duncan.
Thank you very much, Fiona. So I've got one slide, which is totally uninformative in a sense. If we can go to the next slide. And then let's just lose that one. That's fine. So what I just wanted to touch on really was picking up the theme about leadership and place. Fiona talked about PAN system. I'm going to go down to the place level, which we identify effectively as, effectively in our case, it's a unitary boundary. What we've spent a huge amount of time doing at place is actually just building relationships. So we've put a lot of time and effort into what we call a connected leaders meeting. And it's GPs, PCN, clinical directors, most of the executive directors from the council, other leaders from the voluntary sector, anyone who's a system leader in our place. And what we've actually done is just bring people together. And the first set of discussions we talked about was, so what do we want to do? What are we here for? We haven't set huge agendas. We didn't start out with the ICS strategy. We were aware of it, but we didn't start out with it. What we actually did was put a huge amount of time just getting people together, learning to talk the same language, learning to understand the population health of our patch, looking at the big data, but also looking at the little data, looking at the individual stories, the things that were coming through people's, waiting rooms for GPs, the things that were being presented to our teams, etc. Did we really understand what was going on in our locality? Did we really understand what was driving cases we were seeing? What was driving the impact of the population health on the system, or what the system was driving in terms of population health? So we probably spent a couple of years getting together, building that relationship, developing a common language, because between councils, health, the voluntary sector and local people, there is absolutely not a common language. And it was really important we developed a shared language so we all knew what we were talking about. And we also established a few principles. So what we said was, at place level, it doesn't need to be scalable. Every intervention we talk about doesn't need to change the world. If it actually helps 10 people, 100 people, fantastic. It may well be it just helps one person, and maybe we need to rework what we were doing. But by actually giving ourselves permission to try things and fail, because we weren't talking about large scale system interventions, we weren't talking about millions of pounds worth of investment, we were talking about what did the people in the room sit down and say, wouldn't it be great if we got this outcome? It was about the control the people in the room had over their part of the system, and they're coming together to decide to do that differently and try and do things differently. Meant effectively we could rapidly prototype things, we could talk about ideas, we could try ideas. We didn't need necessarily board approval from the system for everything we did. We didn't need funding. What we actually needed was some willing partners who were going to see it through and see if it worked. And in some cases, things have worked really well, and actually it has rolled up and turned out that we do want to scale this up into other places. In some places it's worked really well for us, and in some places, let's be honest, it's not worked at all, and we've stopped doing that and gone back to how we used to do it, and we're thinking about the problem again. But just to give you a couple of examples of things that we're actually really quite proud of that have worked well. We've been looking, I'm sure many people have, at how do we actually stop people getting into the system full stop. So we picked up a lot with GPs that, they would have concerns about people who they were seeing, well, I say regularly, but fairly regularly, maybe for other conditions. And they would notice that people were just not as well as they were. They were getting worse. But what do you do about that? Actually, what we know that leads eventually to is a proper clinical intervention, possibly a hospital stay, possibly some need for some care in the future. But what do we do about that to stop all that happening? So we opened up a locality access point where actually professionals can refer individual cases to a multidisciplinary team as if there had been a problem, but we're doing all of that before there's a problem. So we're actually bringing multidisciplinary team together and saying, look, Mr. or Mrs. So-and-so is getting worse. We're worried about frailty. What can we do to put some care around them, stop them actually becoming more of an impact on the system, protect their health, to protect their independence, to make sure their quality of life is maintained? That's working really, really well. It's very, very low level in lots of places. We're not talking multidisciplinary teams with psychologists and senior clinicians and lots of teams working on individuals because they've got complex needs. We're talking about very practical support, very low level support, but actually this is keeping people's quality of life and independence intact much longer than maybe we would expect to see. But it's not based on clinical data. We can't prove that. It's based on the anecdote from the practitioners who see this all the time. And actually, it's starting to make an impact on the data, very small impact, I should say, at this point. But effectively monitors for the longer term, you will be able to see it's made a difference. But because we gave ourselves permission to try things and said they didn't have to be scalable, we didn't have to try and change the world of every intervention. So that's worked really well. And then I'll stop because I'm very conscious we're slightly over time for questions, but I'll stop after one more example, which might speak to a few people as well. We've been looking a lot at waiting lists. And we're very, very conscious in our place and in our system, children's occupational therapy waiting list is huge. It's measured in year plus. It doesn't really matter how much more money the system gives us. There aren't any more people with that skill set to hire unless we come and take them from all of you. And that's not helping anyone. So we actually sat down and said, so what can we do about this? And what we agreed was that as soon as anyone gets onto that waiting list, we don't treat it as a waiting list. They don't wait until they're called, then they see a professional, then they get a service. We brought together all the people who were around those families, those young people, and said, okay, so what are the interventions we usually see after the clinical intervention that aren't clinical? And we're doing all of those things to start with. So anything that might work to actually get people to have a lower level of need by the time they get through to the clinical side, we're doing. All of the things that the clinicians might have put in place as well as their intervention, we're doing that as soon as we can, because the waiting list for all the aspects of the service wasn't a year plus. The waiting list to see the clinicians was a year plus. The waiting list for some of the voluntary sector support might have been weeks. So actually we're getting all of that in. But actually what we've also done is made a deal with the clinicians that if we can try and take some pressure off by doing that, we're going to free up some of their time, which is counterintuitive, bear in mind the length of their waiting lists. And they're going to go and work with schools and give schools a low-level skill set about what's a good referral, what's a bad referral, and actually where are the places where schools themselves with some support might be able to do the work to stop a referral at all. Because one of the things we're picking up from heads is, obviously totally informally, sometimes they're making the referrals just to get families off their back. Might not be an appropriate referral, but it's the easiest thing for them to do. So sometimes they were doing it, and we're not criticizing anyone for that. We've got to walk in their shoes before we can do that. But if we can help them give us better quality referrals, if we can help get young people and their family support earlier, that seemed like a worthwhile thing to do. So that was very early days, not seeing the impact in terms of statistics right now. But what we are doing is seeing the impact in terms of individuals, with some people who thought they were in for a very long haul on a waiting list, actually getting some support that's really unlocking their problems and helping them within a week or two of actually being put onto that waiting list. So I'll stop there, Stephen, if that's okay. I'm sorry we're slightly over our time, but I'll hand back to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, all three of you, and for a fantastic exposition, really, of making sense of an integrated system. But before we go to the questions, I think just a few things. I mean, Andrew, you were talking about really important point, I think, about the bill and all that goes with it, not diluting the progress that you and obviously others are making, and the strong, I think, theme that we've had throughout around the fundamental importance of relationships and close partnership working. And Fiona, the sense of common purpose is so fundamental, isn't it, in any enterprise, large or small. I did like your non-binary system example, because it's a real issue, isn't it, about the balance between strong emphasis on place and is how does the system join itself up is the best way I can sort of describe it. But I loved your description of all of that, and I think Duncan, just your point about really, which is about local flexibility, local innovation, another feature of successful systems, really. And I liked your point about scalability, a sort of continuum of scale. Yes, something you might want to scale up, but something that's equally valid, maybe only important in a particular setting with a particular group of citizens or patients or whatever it might be. And I think a really interesting point you were making at the end there about not getting hooked up on the sort of big picture issues on waiting lists, because there's an awful lot that we can do to support our citizens in those circumstances, by working together in an integrated way, which you described beautifully. So I think I'll check back with Fiona. I think we can use the hands. So anybody wants to ask a question, please raise your hand, or alternatively put a question comment in the box, and we'll try and pick them up. And so Councillor Van der Hende, and I better pronounce your name incorrectly, so I apologise before you even speak.
Don't worry, I'm used to. I respond to very many things. As you say, I'm a local authority councillor, and I sit on the independent individuals, which is our adult social care scrutiny panel. So I have a particular interest, and I've done that for a number of years. I also chair the Patient Partnership Council in the local trust where I live. So I have, if you like, a foot in both camps. And I think some of the things that you've mentioned, and this may be covered in the other two sessions, so this is the first of three, so forgive me if I'm sort of asking the wrong question. The things that are a concern to me is the democratic responsibility. We are elected, people in the NHS are appointed, so it's not quite the same thing, although non-executive directors, etc., go through a process, but we are democratically elected, so there's an issue there. I'm also concerned about budgets, because one of the things that this is all about is money. At the end of the day, will assist in the success or failure. And from experience, I know that sharing of budgets is very difficult. We've got the local authority budget, you've got the NHS budget sort of thing. So there needs to be some, I guess, understanding of sharing. But also, I think something that was mentioned at the very start is the role of the individual in this, because my experience of the NHS, fortunately from a patient perspective, relatively limited, but it is as if the service is done to people as opposed to being done with the people. And I think that's a really big thing. If we are making this ICS change, which is fantastic, if it works, then there are a number of things that need to be taken into account. The person, the patient, citizen, whatever you want to call them, has to be a very, very key person, which I think has been sort of alluded to in some of the presentations. So those are my things: the democratic process, the budgets and the sharing of it, and the role of the individual in the whole process, because unless the individual feels included, one, they won't contribute to any surveys, etc., that you'd send out, and they will continue to be dissatisfied with whatever emerges from this. Bit of a long question, but thank you very much for listening.
Linda, it's a great. I mean, I'd say there's three questions there, which is fantastic, because that helps to set our agenda for the next few minutes. But I wonder if we could just check in whether anybody else wants to come in, and then what I propose to do, if you're comfortable, colleagues, perhaps take those areas one by one. So your point about democratic responsibility, and I'll ask my colleagues in Frimley whether any of them want to comment on that. And then, I mean, I could sort of kick us off on your budget question, but I'm sure Fiona and others might want to come in on that one. And I think your last point, very, very important indeed, about, in a sense, what's this all for? It should be about improving the lives and the outcomes for the citizens that we're serving in communities. So again, I'll ask our panel to offer some views. But I think I've got, so Lizzie wants to come in. So I'll take a question from Lizzie, and then I'll go to the panel if that's okay. Over to you, Lizzie.
Thanks very much. It sort of links to the democratic issue, but not exactly. I'm a non-executive director in a foundation trust, and I'm just curious about, whilst very much supportive of integrated systems, isn't there inevitably going to be a tension when you're trying to work across a system where you've got, as a non-executive director, very specific responsibilities towards your trust, and where there might then be the potential of a conflict between the interests of the whole system and what's in the best interest of your trust? And I just wonder whether that's been something that's come about within the Frimley arrangement.
Thank you. And if I could just, there's a few questions I'm just trying to keep up with in the chat box, which I'll try and draw out as we go through the conversation. There's a particular one about the engagement of clinicians. And I wonder, Fiona, at some point, if you wouldn't mind commenting on that from your point of view. And there's an issue about, also in the chat box, about conflicts of interest, which maybe we can try and respond to as well. But Andrew, could I come to you? Just on the question of democratic responsibility, do you like to offer a view on that, the first point that we heard from Linda?
Yes, certainly. I sort of sought to pick that up to an extent when I spoke, in that I highlighted the fact that we see that as a real, both an issue and an incredible opportunity. We recognise the mandate, the democratically elected mandate that politicians have, and therefore working with those politicians within the context of both place and, to an extent, system-wide is really, really important. So for us, we're going to have to balance that level of engagement and how we handle that. And of course, the Health and Care Partnership is going to offer a very good opportunity for very significant local authority member involvement, plus of course then links to the Health and Wellbeing Partnership. If you ask me, do I have all the solutions? No, I don't, because we're going to try, as it were, to co-produce that within our partnership over the weeks ahead to end up with hopefully a consensus that works. But yes, we understand the role of democratically elected members. My background was a local authority chief executive for over 20 years, so I'm very acutely aware of the importance of working in a practical way with our local politicians.
Thank you. And Duncan, would you want to add a comment from your perspective?
Just a really brief comment. We've had some really good engagement with our councillors who are very supportive of Frimley, have been out working with Frimley in all sorts of guises for a while now. And one of the things that I thought maybe just worth feeding back to this group, one of our senior councillors said, it's really nice when we talk about Frimley because we actually talk about what's best for my constituents rather than what's best for our organisations. And I think that's a really important thing we need to make sure we keep councillors focused on. They're there on behalf of residents, not there on behalf of a structure. And quite often the disputes, the conflicts will be about what's best for my organisation versus your organisation. Where we've done well is breaking that down and saying, actually, when you come into the room, it's about the population, health and local people. But councillors are in a really key position to keep our feet to the fire on that one and make sure we never lose sight of it. Yes, and that helpfully, I think, links to Michael's point in the chat box about conflicts as well. Thank you. Thank you, Duncan. Just on Linda, again with you on your budget question, and I'm going to look to Fiona for assistance on this in a moment. But the first thing I'd say, go back to my comment about next April is the end of the beginning. I mean, the NHS doesn't really know what its budget is for this year at the moment. We're in this sort of two-step process. H1 and H2 always sounds like a railway development to me, but in H2 we haven't even settled the money for that. Nor is the settlement clear for the next financial year. And I suppose if you broaden your point to social care, to local government, we haven't got a local government settlement either. And as I was saying in the presentation, I think without that we're struggling on many of our ambitions. So I think we've got to be realistic about what can happen between now and April. I think we will spend between now and April 23
working through how financial allocations, that's how we think, in the part of the world I am in the north of England, working through. And there's a lot of difference, isn't there, between local government and the NHS that we need to understand and respect. Having said that, I think there are opportunities that already exist through Section 75 and other ways where we could potentially expand funding in an integrated way without waiting for all of that. But Fiona, do you have any observations on that particular point?
Yeah, I mean, I'd wrap it up also possibly with the conflict of interest point as well. So how we've managed the whole money debate over the years in Frimley has been to try to be really transparent about where and how, so building a picture of where health investment is made, what is more fixed in terms of that financial flow, given the interventions and contractual arrangements. Also, more recently, really beginning to share local authorities' expenditure profiles as well. And then saying, well, where have we got flexibility within an overarching financial strategy that supports our overall common purpose? Because it's really difficult when you've got stark inequalities faced to you to not get behind that as a community, as long as you can give certainty about some of, if you like, the more fixed financial flows to all your partners. And then you look to really prioritise where you've got some flexibility, which we've had it through obviously the pandemic funding, but also transformation funding, and being very open with partners about that. It still doesn't mean to say those conversations aren't difficult, and you get the tension with, can't you just delegate it all to place? Well, actually, as you've eloquently described, Stephen, we can't delegate anything at the moment because of the pandemic scenario and how the financials are. But we're trying to make sure we talk about it, show the data we've got, and make decisions in a transparent way together, but also be honest about the constraints. On the conflict of interest question, and particularly the non-exec role, I was a provider chief. I'm actually still seconded as a provider chief for 20 odd years. I would say, and of a foundation trust, I would say, and I've seen Frimley Health, who's our largest provider and pan-system provider in Frimley, they've rethought their strategy in the context of the population health strategy of the system, and to be really clear that there isn't a distinction. There's a role and function for the provider to contribute to delivering the common purpose and overall strategy, and identify where there might be tension in delivering transformation and change. But actually the objects of foundation trusts are for public benefit. And so I would really challenge, and I do, my provider colleagues and boards to really own that and think about that in a collective way, but also say where it gives you real tension. And so we then explore it and talk about it together and see what we can shift and do if we're doing something that is going to feel fundamentally destabilising to an organisation.
Yeah, that's good. And I think you can write that, can't you, in effect, into the constitution of the ICS, which formally reinforces what you've really described really well there, Fiona. Michael, I see you want to come in. Is it on this topic?
I do. It's very much so. And thank you, Fiona, and Duncan, indeed, and Andrew as well. And I think picking up a point you made earlier, Stephen, if the guidance and the regulation actually isn't as permissive as what is in the bill itself, that may give us some problems. And I do accept that actually where you have a good relationship, you can actually overcome mountains. But that's the bit. So I'm pleading with the LGA and the Confed and the various national bodies to actually make sure that the Constitution is so crafted that it gives us that local flexibility, as you both described.
That's really helpful, Michael, and it's a powerful point that we will continue to reflect reflect back. Just before I just wanted to come on to Linda's other point, and I'd wanted to pick up the point about clinical engagement and time. But just a couple of the things in the chat box, that the point I think Kate makes about should we press ahead with the development of place. I mean, a very simple answer, yes. I think this is linked to the permissiveness point that Michael and others have mentioned. And I think most ICSs, as I understand it, are really focusing down on trying to get the shape of their, notwithstanding your very important point, Fiona, about what is place, but getting getting those arrangements established is one of the fundamental building blocks for next April. So I think that's where I would suggest you go with that if you're thinking about it in your area. Now, could I just turn to there's one or two other points in the chat box I may come back to, but we won't lose them, folks, because obviously we'll keep them as part of the record and furthering of this discussion beyond today. So Linda's other point was really about the role of the citizen, the engagement of the citizen, and so on. Duncan, and then I'll go to Andrew. Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, obviously, as a council, we've got lots of engagement mechanisms already in place. What we didn't do as a local authority was build more. So we already have Health Watch, for example, on the Health and Wellbeing Board. We already have a number of different people representing different organisations involved through that mechanism. We have lots of engagement mechanisms. What we wanted to do was make sure we actually tied up those mechanisms to the job in hand. Now, I won't speak about the ICS particular. I'll let Fiona come in and talk about ICS engagement with the public, or that level of engagement. What we particularly wanted to do was actually understand what lens people wanted to speak through. I have to say there's a small number of people who want to speak about the governance of clinical process or health and wellbeing board and membership. Most people want to know when they need something, they're getting it, and they want to understand how that system works. So what we've been trying to do very much is make sure we're capturing people's stories. So we've got a platform at the council, which is, it doesn't matter what it's called, but basically what it does, it allows people to set up their own story. So when we want to do something around, say, a pathway or an intervention or some work around health determinants, we can actually set something up and just say to people, look, tell us what it's like for you. What's your individual experience? And we're finding that much more powerful than actually trying to engage with people through surveys and so on, because you've got to try and ask the right questions, get the right people. Actually just saying to people, what's your story? If people are having a good time, they tend not to bother engaging with us. It's the people who haven't had the good time who tell their stories. They're absolutely the ones we want to hear. They're the ones where the system didn't work for that person. So what do we want to do differently? And that's a new piece of work for us. We've had that platform in for about a year, so it's growing. But it has proved to be very, very powerful to just say to people, look, don't worry about the format. Don't worry about how you're doing it. Just tell us what you want to tell us about your engagement with this mechanism, this process, this system.
Thank you, Duncan. And Andrew, did you want to add anything to what Duncan said?
Yes, just very briefly. I mean, when I chaired one of the CCGs, which is now part of the Frimley CCG, for a couple of years, one of the things that was really powerful was having a patient story at board meetings. And that's something I'd like to replicate going forward within the system. It really grounds you in what really matters to people. On the point of consultation, Fiona touched on this. We put a lot of effort into getting the voice of our residents when developing our strategy through citizens panel, surveys, drop-ins and so forth. And that's really very important to us. In terms of one question I noticed on chat around independent patient representation on the board, to be frank, we don't have that on our current system board, of course, which is informal, but that will be something we'll be building in now to our statutory board going forward, and rest assured it will be there.
Thank you, Andrew. Now we're almost at time. I know you want to come back, Linda. You might be able to, but I'm just going to go to a couple of comments in the chat box just to make sure we've covered them off. Andrew, you just kindly answered Dillis's question really about, and all I would add is that this is back to discretion and permissiveness. I think how you populate your board really we're down to individual ICSs against a minimum specification. But I think most ICSs will be wanting to ensure they've got a strong patient's voice in their board level arrangements. Graham makes a point, and I think it's a point just to acknowledge, and it really reflects back, Fiona, to what you were saying, about common purpose. Your point about the biggest challenge is often getting people to come together in a willing coalition. Absolutely, and you have to work hard at that. And I think some of the learning that Fiona got across is a good way to go. And then Steve Russell makes, I think, an important point, a different balance around this sort of not being binary, perhaps. But yes, we do want to retain, I think, the lighter weight and more agile ways of working as a result of COVID. But I think we would probably all agree for some big picture things, like the example you give around digital transformation, and Fiona, you were giving an example of that in your presentation. Yeah, absolutely. I think that there probably has to be some greater necessary bureaucracy, as you put it, behind that. So look, we're approaching the end. There's never enough time. But I'm really grateful to all of the participants because I think we've got a massive amount of rich information and thoughts back from you in this very short space of time. And I think it bodes very well for the future webinar events. So, really grateful for you attending today. And just to reinforce Fiona's message, please, if you get the chance, just filling the evaluation form. And could I also then just extend, a really big thank you to Andrew, Duncan, and Fiona for your contribution and really coherent set of messages and learning. Top tips, I think, was a phrase used at one point for all of us working in the developing ICS movement across the country. So a very big thank you to you for your time today as well. So I think in terms of next steps, we will essentially we've recorded this, as we said, we'll be feeding this back, we'll be sharing the learning from this discussion and using some of the themes here, I think, to build into the next two sessions that I built earlier on. So thanks again to everybody and have a great rest of the day.
Thank you.